Welcome back, everybody. Today we're getting into the scope that you see right here in my hands. This is the Burris XTR 2 1:8 scope. Now they've had the 1.5 up for a while, 1.5 to 8. This one's the 1 to 8, and I think it's new for 2017, at least as far as I know anyway. And they have a couple different things going on with it. They offer a couple different reticles, and they also offer it in both first focal plane and second focal plane. And I think these days, a lot of shooters are thinking first focal plane's the best. There's pros and cons to each, but just a quick breakdown of that for you guys out there trying to figure out which one you want to go with, should you choose to go with this scope, is that first focal plane, the BDC reticle, which this one has, is going to be usable at all magnifications. So you can actually range with it at 1 power, you can range with it at 4 power, you can range with it at 8 power. You can use your holdovers at 1 power, you can use your holdovers at 4 power, you can use your holdovers at 8 power. They work the whole way through. Whereas with the second focal plane, that'll really only work on the highest magnification. Of course, the reticle's still there at 1 power, it's just not calibrated correctly for the BDC to work. So that's sort of one thing to think about. We may talk about some others here in just a second, but this one is made in Japan. It has the Japanese HD glass, which is excellent. It has Burris's coatings on there, which do a good job of really good color correction and light transmission throughout the spectrum when you're talking about either out in bright sunlight or in low light or dawn and dusk conditions. It does a very, very good job. So that's sort of a quick overview of the scope. Now let's get into some of the details after the dogs check it out. Getting into the details of the scope, we'll start in the back and sort of work our way forward as a way to make some sense of it. Here we have the eye focus piece, and you can see this one actually has a good bit of adjustability to it. So I generally, because I have very good eyes, I'm lucky to have them, and I have very good vision, I tend to almost always get it focused all the way down. But some of you guys out there are going to need to set the reticle focus to your eye. Once you set it, though, it's a set it and forget it kind of thing. They do come with scope caps, by the way. I just took them off for the video, but there's a myriad of ways to do this. I personally like to look at a spot in the sky and look through it until the reticle is in focus rather. Just keep turning it a little bit, look away, and then look at it. You don't want to look at the reticle while you're turning it, because if you do that, your eyes will focus naturally. It's just something the eye does. So you want to look away, turn it, look at it, look away, turn it, until you get a very crisp, clear reticle. So continuing to move forward, we have the magnification adjustment ring here. Now this is going to be one of my minor criticisms of the scope. So it's nice that it turns very smoothly, which it absolutely does. I do like that. But I wish there was a bigger knob, and I would imagine this little thing right here is a screw that allows for the use of a knob, but I wish it came with it anyway, that you could actually grab and turn very quickly. So it's a little bit hard to do, particularly up on the rifle, to get all the way through, because for 1 to 8, you have to turn it a good bit. It's not just a little bit like some of the 1 to 4s out there. You really got to kind of crank it and kind of make 2 rotations. If you had a large lever, it would definitely make it a little bit easier. The tube on the scope is a 34mm tube. Now that's both good and bad. The good things about it is that theoretically it's going to give you a little bit more of a rugged, more durable scope, especially with the erectors that are in there. It's also going to, in theory, again, allow for more light in. I'm not so sure how true that really is in real life though, but it also does add a little bit of weight to it over a 30mm scope. So this scope is not super heavy, but it's not super light either. This one comes in right at 24 ounces on my scale without the mount. Of course, the worn mount, I left that on there because I'm actually going to shoot this particular scope tomorrow, and I didn't want to have to remount it and do all the re-Loctiting again. So you guys are going to have to bear with me for that, but it'll actually be good here in just a second when we do some size comparisons. But the reticles, or rather the knobs, are what I want to talk about next. So each of them are a 1/10 of a mil adjustment. So with our elevation, it does have a 0 stop. We have that set up there. So if I quiet down, you might be able to hear just how they sound when you actually turn the turrets. But they're very tactile, very audible, not mushy. So on that front, they're very good. And the windage here does have a cap on it. And this is actually as they come from the factory, as you guys are seeing it here. So you have the ability to dial it in. But again, it's got a good bit of resistance to it. So it'd be tough to actually accidentally bump this, but again, it's got the zero stop turret, so you would know if you're off. If you see it on 2 or something like that, you know it should be on 0, you'll know you're off. But very difficult to bump, but in theory, I guess it is possible. Now with a ballistic type reticle like we have in this one here, which we haven't talked about reticles yet, but we will in just a second, they give you the option to change the turrets out to ones just like we have here on the Winded, which are sort of a set it and forget it kind of thing. I do like that. And the system they have, just basically you take out 2 little screws on here, the exact same way you would do it to set up your zero stop. And then you install these turrets, which as you guys can see on the Windage one, it says right that way, and this one it says up because this is for the elevation to replace this one. At that point, you'd have 2 cap turrets, and that's just going to prevent anything from bumping it in any sort of way. And with a ballistic type reticle where you're going to use holdovers and the reticle itself gives you the range estimation, I think that is kind of the way to go. I just kind of wanted to show you both and leave them off so you guys could actually see the different offerings there for the turrets. On the left side of the scope, we have our brightness settings. So we also have our battery compartment. I'll see if I can unscrew that real quick. Of course, it is sealed up to prevent from any sort of water getting in there and damaging it. But you can see there it does come with a Sony CR2032 battery. And should you need to replace it down the road, they're fairly simple and fairly easy to find out there these days. I've even seen them at Walmart. So they are out there on the streets. Most places you pick up battery, and of course online, they're everywhere. So the illumination settings on there are pretty good, in my opinion. I don't really have any issue with them. One thing they have that I do like is an intermediate point. So if you're at any level, let's say, I don't know, we'll pick it here and say you're between 10 and 11, which are the 2 brightest settings. You can actually set it to that center dot there, so that way it's off. And then without having to spin through the whole amount of brightness settings, you can go right to 10 or right to 11. So you don't need to spin through it as if there weren't any intermediate stops. Now settings 1 and 2 are night vision compatible, so those of you guys who want to use this for hunting, put that night vision out front, you can, and you'll be just fine with it. You could actually put it behind it, I suppose as well, but that would sort of be an eye relief kind of issue. But either way, it is night vision compatible and will not damage those devices. The illumination, as you guys can see here, is actually pretty good. Now, this particular one is the first focal plane scope. I didn't mention earlier, but they do also offer this in a second focal plane option. So for those who want, I guess basically there's a whole debate as to what's better and what's worse in terms of that. But with the first focal plane, you don't get as bright of illumination as you do, generally speaking, with a second focal plane. It's just sort of one of the things that I've noticed over the years. So if you guys want really bright illumination, maybe look at the second focal plane option. But I think most people these days want first focal plane in these low power variable scopes, and the illumination here is just fine. I've used this out in very bright settings. You can still see it. I mean, it's not super bright, but you can see it even out in the brightest of days. And in most normal conditions, as you guys can see here in the pictures I'm rolling in, you can see it just fine. So for most folks, it's going to look just fine. And the actual illumination itself is very crisp until you get to setting 11. When you actually get to 11, it does start to have a little bit of bleed to it, but overall not bad. And it definitely is visible in probably 90% of the conditions that you're going to see it in. It's going to be sort of pop out at you visible. And then again, in the brightest of bright days, it'll still be visible, just not super jumping out at you. The scope comes with a couple different reticles. It comes with the ballistic dot reticle that you guys see here on your screen, and then it also comes with the ballistic circle dot, which is the one I went with and that you guys see now on your screen. And the reason I went with this one is because I think that's the one most folks are going to go with. It has that red circle in there that's going to really draw your eye into it and aid in very fast shooting for CQB type scenarios, which is good for 3-gun, also good for home defense and many other types of close engagement shooting. So start out right in the middle, and you guys can see that center dot is very small. It's smaller than an MOA, and you're looking at 1/10 of a mil. So it's very tiny, and will allow you to get a good, small, fine point of aim when you're zeroing it in. And then from there, once you have your zero, you're going to use your holdovers, which is what you see on the way down. So those lines, those crossing lines, correspond to 18 inches at a given distance. So the first one down is going to be 300 yards, then 400 yards, then 500 yards, and the bottom of the line there, right above the F that you guys see, is going to be your 600-yard point of impact, assuming that you have a round that lines up with this BDC, which we're going to get into here in just a second. So One thing I missed, I skipped the 200-yard mark. So the 200-yard mark is the top of the line, the top of the vertical line. So that's where you're going to hold there, assuming you zero at 100 yards, which is what you should be doing to use this reticle properly. So basically, the 18 inches is a way to range estimate someone's distance away from you. So the military and their doctrine uses 18 inches as a guide, and most optics companies use it as well because it's sort of an industry standard, but it's roughly the distance of the average person from shoulder to shoulder. So either as they're standing looking at you, or if they're laying down in the prone looking at you, you can put that line across their shoulders, and wherever it lines up, that's roughly about how far away they are. From that point, you can just start engaging. Now, you can also use the 18-inch measurement for anything else. So if you're using animals, and say like a deer in your area where you live are generally speaking 36 inches long, well, you can half it and use it in that way. So there's other ways to use it besides just on people, but that is what it comes from. So let's talk about the actual BDC here. It's designed for the M855 out of a 16-inch barrel, and when you run the data on that, it lines up perfectly, at least in my ballistic app. Now, I wanted to try a couple other loads just to see how they would work. And with the M193 load, you can see how it lines up here. It's just a touch off, and that's to be expected. But for most folks at distance, you're not going to be able to shoot that well anyway. But just letting you guys know, it does roughly correlate to M193 as well. Now, I generally rather shoot a 223 remanufactured 55 grain load from Freedom Munitions, which is a little bit lower powered and generally going to get a few hundred feet per second less than M193 would. You guys can see how it lines up here. So if I was, a shooter, or any of you guys out there, and you want to see how the load that you're going to use it with lines up to it, if you're not using M855 rather, you can just run it in a ballistic app and see. So it's going to be close, but it's not always spot on. But your range estimation is always going to be on. You're just going to have to hold a little bit different for your point of aim if you're using a type of ammo that doesn't line up with it. But again, if you're using 855, you're right on the money. And if you're using M193, you're pretty darn close as well. And on the horizontal axis, you have 1 mil increments between each of the tick marks. So that can be used for wind holds depending on the distance that you're actually shooting at. The 1 mils, of course, is going to correlate to different things, again, depending on the distance that you're at. So it just gives you a point of reference to hold off there for windage as well. I realize some of you guys live places where they're not going to have these on the shelves for you to go check out, so I wanted to give you a quick size comparison with it. Of course, there's our XTR2, a few different scopes here. This is a Trijicon AccuPower 1:4, and these, of course, are 30mm scopes, but you can see there it's just smaller pretty much in every way. It's a little bit shorter than the XTR, and just a smaller profile overall. Now, a couple other offerings, a little bit on the budget side. This is the primary arms 1:6, and you can see again it's going to be a little bit smaller. These 1:8s with the 34mm tubes just tend to be a little bit on the larger side. And the other offering we have out here, just again for example's sake, is the Steiner PX4. It's a 1:4, so this is probably the smallest of the bunch. It's right there with the Trijicon. I think it's a little bit smaller actually, but you can see just sort of how they compare overall to one of the larger 1:8 scopes. Just a few more things to go over here with this scope before we close it out. So first and foremost, we'll list all the basic specs over here on the side of your screen so you can see sort of how they stack up with some of the other offerings out there on the market. I think it's pretty good in terms of the eye box from the actual shooter's perspective. It's very forgiving. You can have your head off a little bit if you're in an awkward shooting position, i.e. not in the prone or not standing, and your eye isn't in the perfect spot. It's very forgiving on the low power, as you would imagine. And even on 8 power, it does give you some wiggle room. Probably a little bit more than some out there, a little bit less than others. So there's pros and cons to everything, but it is very usable from that perspective. The glass is very clear, like we talked about. There's absolutely zero issue with that. Nothing to complain about at all from a glass perspective. The reticle works. It works with a bunch of different loads, as we talked about. Of course, 855 and M193 are the most common, and they work really well with that. It also works with some 308 loadings. Just from me running the data, a couple 130 grain loads in 308, one of the 147s I ran, which was the Freedom offering, and then also one of the 155, which is a Hornady load I put through it, are pretty darn close as well. People always ask me what that app is that I'm using, by the way. I just mentioned that here. It's Strelok Pro. It's not free. You do have to buy it, but it's not too expensive, and it's very usable, so that is a good app. I'm sure there's many others out there. They just got a free plug here on the channel. But anyway, that is what I use. And back to the scope, one thing I know everybody wants to know is the price point. MSRP on it, I think, is like $1,500. But if you look around on the street, you're going to find it from like $980. The cheapest I found it today, and most places are going to have it for about $1,200. So in the category that it's in, with the Japanese HD glass, Japanese construction, 34 millimeter tube, there's a few others out there like the Trijicon, the Primary Arms Platinum, the Loophole is in that market. In terms of price wise, it's at the low end of that spectrum, and in terms of performance, it performs excellently. So basically, if you're out there considering the different options in the marketplace at that 1 to 8 34 millimeter tube sort of category, this one's very good. It's absolutely competitive with them. Like I said, the only kind of complaint I have is that ring, the throw ring. Of course, I'm sure somebody out there makes something aftermarket that can help with that. But otherwise, I mean, it's a very good scope. I don't really have a lot bad to say about it. If you guys have any questions about it that I didn't cover here in the video, by all means, you can post down below in the comment section. You can also post those over at my Facebook page. That's generally the best place to get in touch with me these days. I don't really see all my comments here on YouTube like I used to, but I generally see them over there at Facebook. But that's about it, guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing, and I hope to see you in the next video.